to make a stop at 7th grade land. But our final destination is going to be big kid, okay? But the main idea, the learning target, we're going to do like the 7th grade version and the high school version today. And that learning target is I can solve proportions. So, some of us, especially, because we know that 7th grade year was exactly when the world started to fall apart, depending on where your 7th grade teacher was, this might be familiar to you. If you need paper to write on, I have paper right there, honey. But you definitely want to write this down. So a proportion, for those of us who might not remember from 7th grade or who maybe just didn't get taught that at all, for that matter, a proportion is really just an equation. It's simply an equation that has fractions in it. More specifically, ratios. When you were in 6th grade, you first got introduced to ratios. Ratios are really just another way to say fractions. So a proportion is just an equation that has fractions on either side of it. Now, do not write what I am getting ready to write, because personally, this is not the way that I'm going to show you how to solve a proportion. But for a lot of you guys, this is probably going to look familiar. So don't write this. But a lot of you guys probably remember something like this. The little butterfly cross-multiplying stuff. Now, depending on the teacher, there's all kinds of cutesy names for it. Cross-multiplying, butterfly, stuff like that. Well, butterfly is the only cute one, I guess. I don't teach it that way because my experience is, like, a lot of teachers teach it because it's, like, quick. It is quick, okay? And it's easy to memorize the steps. But the problem with it, though, is that it only works with this type of equation. So then what happens in my experience is that kids get to a different type and they try to cross-multiply even though you can't. So that's why I don't teach cross-multiplying. They don't teach it in the upper grades anymore. They used to, but my understanding is they don't anymore in the upper grades either. If you had a 7th grade teacher that taught you how to cross-multiply and you get the right answer every time, I'm not going to tell you don't do it, okay? I'm certainly not going to do that. Most people can't pull that off. Like 2 years later, they're like, I remember how to do it, and it doesn't mess up the rest of your math. But I'm not going to be like, nope, you can't solve it that way. But I'm going to show you my way, which really, you're not doing anything different than you already know how to do. Your goal is that you are still trying to isolate the variable, figure out what that variable is equal to. So the big idea is still the same. You're still going to isolate the variable. We're not even going to take like major notes about this, to be honest. In this case, what is sitting there? I really didn't think you were going to make that. Good job. Okay. What is sitting there with the variable that needs to go? The 6. Are you adding the 6, subtracting, multiplying, dividing? You're dividing. And how are you going to cancel out that division? You're going to cancel it out by multiplying. Okay? So you are still doing exactly what you have been doing for weeks. Okay? In this case, you're going to isolate that variable. And the way you're going to do it is you're going to cancel. I'm going to use the baby division symbol just because I feel like it'll be less confusing for you to look back at it later. We're going to cancel dividing by 6 with multiplying by 6. So you've been using inverse operations. You've been canceling things out for weeks. So it really kind of just makes sense, in my opinion, to just keep going on that way. So the opposite, the inverse of dividing by 6 is to multiply by 6. And I have to make sure I do it where? On both sides, of course. Okay. So let's look at what's going to happen there when I multiply both sides by 6. So first of all, what's going to happen with those two? They cancel each other out. Same thing that's been happening for weeks that we've been solving equations. The only part I just kind of want to give you a heads up, so make sure that we do the right-hand side correctly, okay? So we've canceled out those 6s. So what you need to do to make sure that you do the right-hand side correctly is you need to multiply that 6 times the 5. Then you're going to take that answer and divide by 4. So all you're doing is canceling out that division with multiplication. The only tricky part is just making sure that you multiply, because what I see people do wrong a lot is I see them multiply the numerator and the denominator by that number, and you don't do that. Okay, you might remember from middle school, technically that 6 is the same thing as 6 over 1. And then you just multiply the numerators and then multiply the denominators. So you're really just doing 6 times 5. Then you're going to take that answer and divide by 4. So, of course, if we do that, that would be 30 divided by 4. And remember, in algebra, we like fractions. Okay? So answers, why is that not writing? It's probably because it wants me to say a math word. Instead of answer, we're going to call it a solution, which is what it really is. Solutions should be a whole or an integer. So like a negative whole number or a positive whole number, or a simplified fraction. Remember, in algebra, we like fractions, especially next unit when we start graphing lines. We need fractions. We got to have fractions in our life because that's where rise over run comes from. So I want you to get in the habit of using fractions on a regular basis. So solutions should be an integer or a simplified fraction. Yes, ma'am, Chloe? I was just getting there because, and that's why I wrote first, your solution should be an integer or a simplified fraction. Is 30 over 4 simplified? No, it's not. And she noticed that, right? Because you can divide both 30 and 4 by, what can you divide them both by? They're even, correct. So you can divide them both by 2. So the real answer I want from you is 15 over 2 because you can simplify it that way. If you're like me and you struggle with remembering like whether or not you can simplify stuff. So again, all I did was I noticed that 30 and 4 were both divisible by 2, which is why I simplified it and got 15 over 2. But let's say I'm not good at that part. I struggle with remembering whether or not that's a simplified fraction. Easy peasy. Your calculator will do that work for you. Yes, sir. Yes, write a Post-it note, please. So let me remind you how to do that. So you would just do 30 divided by 4. Use that math button. Option 1 is fraction, and it will simplify it for you, even if you don't remember exactly how to simplify yourself. Yeah, I'll grab it. So any questions about number 1? You're not doing anything you don't already know how to do. You're just isolating the variable. That might have been confusing to you. Yeah, that's multiplication. So here, I'll put them in parentheses instead of, that was a dot. That wasn't a decimal. That was a 6.5. But I'll put parentheses. So now does that make sense? Okay. Now, those of you guys that have already looked ahead on your classwork a little bit might notice that not all of them just have the variable in the numerator. Because really, when the variable's in the numerator, all you got to do is cancel out whatever you're dividing it by. But there are several on your paper that don't have the variable in the numerator. Okay, so for example, 8 over 10 is equal to 4 over p. Okay, so here is the problem with this one. Okay, you can't, and this is going to be important for the entire rest of your math career. You can't isolate the variable in the denominator. I know you've already figured out that answer in your head. Thank you.
It's pretty easy, but like if we can, do we have to like on a test? Do we have to show our work? Like we would have to multiply by 4.
I understand. So this one, I understand how you got this one because this one's pretty easy. Most of them in your classwork is not going to be this easy. I'm really just using this to like show you how to do it. Most of them are going to be like, they're not going to be where it's pretty obvious you just cut them in half. I get what you just did there. Okay, but this is more like for the more complicated ones down the road. So you can't isolate the variable in the denominator because you're not doing P divided by 4, you're doing 4 divided by P. So you can't cancel out, so here, there's a very easy solution to that. You can't isolate the variable in the denominator, so flip.
Make it negative.
Nope, you don't even need to do that. Flip. So instead of 8 over 10, it's going to be 10 over 8. Instead of 4 over P, it's going to be P over 4.
Isn't that keep change?
Which is the same thing.
That is,
Oh, wait, no.
so you're thinking about dividing a fraction. And make sure that you flip the entire proportion.
Isn't that called the reciprocal?
It is called the reciprocal. I was getting ready to say that.
I had a good teacher.
Aww.
I didn't like her, but I had a good teacher.
You know, that happens with a lot of really good teachers sometimes aren't that likable.
Yeah. Like Mrs. Breland, nobody likes Mrs. Breland.
All right, don't mention anybody by name. We're recording. Okay, so yes. So all you have to do, if you need the P to be on top so that you can isolate it, all you got to do is flip it. You just got to make sure that you flip both sides, because we know what you do on one side, you have to do on the other side, right? And I know good and well what Mikey's sitting here doing in his head, that he's like, oh, well, 8 divided by 2 is 4, so 10 divided by 2 is obviously going to give me 5. Let's pretend we don't know that for a minute.
That would be not very smart of us as mathematicians.
Number sense is a whole different animal sometimes, So let's pretend for a minute that we don't know that. P divided by 4, the opposite of dividing by 4 would be multiplying. So you would just do exactly the same thing that you did before, where you would cancel out that dividing by 4 by multiplying by 4. So what you would do in this case is you would do the 4 times 10. You're welcome. And divide that by 8. And that will give you P, since the 4's cancel out on the other side. So what's 4 times 10? 40. What's 40 divided by 8? 5. Exactly. So 5 is equal to P. So you're really not doing anything that you don't already know how to do on these. You are just isolating the variable. That's all you're doing. So any questions about the basic ones? Because if you look over on page 2, you're going to see they're not as basic. So we need to go over a couple of those. So any questions about where I got any of these from? And I know I'm running my mouth a lot today. Tomorrow, I'm going to be shutting up the entire time. I promise. Okay. Promise. Or, I'll promise if you promise. All right.